挽回。
雑教はこれにておしまい。
Reading throughout Bleach, you'll notice that the title of Kenpachi is seen almost like the peak of power for a Shinigami. From the beginning, the title has signified many things. The one who has it lives for bloodshed and battle and has killed more than any other Shinigami in the Soul Society. But one thing that the title absolutely stands for, and has been stated time and time again, is that the one who holds this title is the strongest of all Shinigami. Only one Kenpachi can hold this title of a generation, and they are genuinely feared among allies and enemies alike. Zaraki, the 11th Kenpachi, is talked about in this way of being this huge asset for the Soul Society during critical times, and is also seen as this barbaric demon that does whatever he wants despite being on the Soul Society side. He is feared to the point where he looks as if he can do what he wants without consequence. He's kinda seen as the Soul Society's Hulk that they can send out to rampage on request. This is pretty important because Unohana not only also held this title herself, but was actually the first Kenpachi who set the standard of what a Kenpachi is supposed to mean, and also set Kenpachi Zaraki on the path of becoming Kenpachi. I think I speak for most people when I say that she really is one of the best characters Kubo has written. The foreshadowing and reveal of this darker, more menacing woman, who was once the most diabolical enemy of the Soul Society, is one of the best things I've ever seen in manga. But a question that I've wanted to answer, and some of the fandom have been curious about, is if Unohana really was the strongest Shinigami as her title of Kenpachi implies. Who is the strongest has always been a contentious topic within the fandom, especially when you have monsters like Zaraki and Yamamoto, and even gods like Aizen and Ichibei. But aside from Unohana's title of Kenpachi, she does have numerous statements and narrative implications, solidifying her as one of the strongest Shinigami in the series. Though she is someone who gets equally underrated and overrated, I actually believe her character is a lot more complex and difficult to understand for most people when it comes to her strength and role throughout the story. In fact, I would even go as far as to say that Unohana is surprisingly underrated, if anything. This video will go over her as realistically as I can and will describe her character traits and her role that has held her back during the story, so that we can know the limits of what her abilities really can be argued as. I think this video is very important for people to not only understand Unohana as a character, but to also understand her power, which can help with other scaling down the line in the series. This video will not only go over the Thousand Year Blood War manga and anime, but also extra material like the Can't Free Your Own World and the Spirits Are Forever With You novels, which I feel many people tend to overlook when scaling her that might actually be interesting to hear about. Now, if this is your first time coming here, or maybe you learned something or liked this video, then please consider subscribing. I would really appreciate it. And with that out of the way, let's get into it, guys. To us readers, before there was Yachiru Unohana, there was Retsu Unohana, the kind, mother-like figure of Squad 4 whose only role throughout the story was to heal her allies and sometimes even her enemies. Sometime before Tenjiro's promotion to the Royal Guard for creating Kaido, he taught and trained Unohana in the healing arts. So much so that she became the Soul Society's best healer and laid down the foundation and expectations of Squad 4. Her healing is so potent that she can not only heal the body, but she can also quickly restore the spiritual energy of someone, which is something not even Orihime can quickly do with her powerful ability of rejection. Unohana is capable of instantly healing wounds that should have otherwise killed someone or even herself. Her analytical skills and knowledge of the anatomy are so great that she could tell something was off when examining Aizen's fake dead body, something even Aizen himself praised her for. I actually think this is quite impressive since only her and Yamamoto, the two most experienced Shinigami, were able to either find a way around Aizen's Kyoka Suigetsu or knew something was weird while under his hypnosis. She knowingly is not only feared but respected by many old and powerful captains such as Ukitake, Shunsui, Kuryoshiki, and even Yamamoto. Shunsui and Ukitake even call her Senpai while Kuryoshiki calls her Nisan. She is very well respected, and so respected that in fact she is the only person that can question Yamamoto without consequence. Now, despite not being a fighter during her time as Retsu Unohana, she actually has a few statements letting you know that she's more than just Soul Society's healer and is someone who is just as old, experienced, and scary as Head General Yamamoto. In the data book, she has pretty high stats, being third overall in stats behind Aizen. But something people should know and hopefully realize by now is that these stats aren't meant to compare characters to each other. It's used to show how close a character is to reaching their full potential. For example, both Mayuri and Ukitake share a 100 in intelligence, but this doesn't mean that they are equal in intelligence, but it only means that they both have reached their maximal potential in that category. Another example is that Komamura has a 100 in offense and Byakuya has a 90, but it doesn't mean Komamura is stronger than Byakuya in offensive abilities. Regardless of all of this, I don't think most people use the data book stats anymore since they are not only outdated, but you can't use them to compare characters against one another. But I still think it was worth noting that even before Yachiru Unohana, Retsu Unohana had extremely high data book stats behind the two strongest Shinigami at the time, showing not only her experience but her power. Something else the data book says that's a lot more important is that Unohana has the highest offensive abilities among the captains, and if she loses her temper, she may be the most fearsome captain. Now this is actually a really good statement for Unohana that I'm going to go over more later in the video, but this statement is at least putting her offensive abilities over someone as powerful as Yamamoto himself. Though vague, or maybe even us readers couldn't understand, the manga and the data books before Thousand Year Blood War gave us hints or at least implications that Retsu Unohana was not just a healer, but someone who was reserved in her mannerisms but also had battle power and experience on head Captain Yamamoto's level. Now that we've kind of gone over Retsu Unohana, I want to go over her real persona, Yachiru Unohana, the first Kenpachi. 1,000 years ago, Unohana was known as the most notorious criminal the Soul Society has ever had. This is actually pretty interesting, especially during a time like this where Yamamoto and the OG captains that served under him were known as bloodthirsty killers who struck fear into the hearts of their enemies, and even the Quincy King Yuha himself. Yamamoto at this time apparently saw potential in Unohana during her criminal reign and either subdued or convinced her to join the Gotei as the captain of the 11th Division. Unohana during her time as a captain created the basis of the 11th Division and at some point was either given the title of Kenpachi from Yamamoto or came up with the idea herself. It doesn't appear that anyone among the Gotei challenged or questioned her title as Kenpachi, and she officially kept her title until she retired. During hundreds of years as her time as a captain, Unohana killed and slaughtered enemies and innocents alike, trying to find a powerful opponent to satisfy her. At some point she eventually grew bored with being a Shinigami, grew bored of the sword, and grew bored of fighting. That is until she met a young child who would eventually be known as Kenpachi from Zaraki. The battle between Unohana centuries ago with this child known as Zaraki was a battle that both experienced unparalleled joy. Both felt the pleasure that they have never felt before. It was the first time that Kenpachi has ever felt fear during a battle, and not even his battles with the strongest Espadas, the strongest Quincy's, and even the previous Kenpachis could satisfy him in the slightest. Unohana was the first foe that could rival Kenpachi's power, and she not only thought he was stronger than her, but she found him worthy of holding her title of Kenpachi that she strongly held for about 1,000 years. He learned the joy of fighting on the edge with Unohana and thought if he killed her, he would never experience that joy of a battle again. This is the start of Kenpachi's self-suppression throughout the story and how he placed mental shackles on himself. This is also Unohana's sin, as she calls it. Kenpachi suppressed his own power because of his love for battle and the desire for it to never end. He hid his power away into a deep dark place that by the time we are introduced to him into the story, he is nothing but an empty husk when compared to who he once was. Now, Kenpachi's scaling throughout the story is pretty interesting before Thousand Year Blood War, especially because of his self-inflicted mental nerfs. During the Soul Society arc, we know that despite not being who he once was, he is still feared among the Gotei, or I guess you can say thought of as this monster. Hinataro from the 4th Division talks about Zaraki and the title of Kenpachi and how terrifying he is. Kaname Tosen thinks Kenpachi is a bloodthirsty demon who doesn't deserve to be a captain, and Komamura calls him the Great Kenpachi. So he's talked about a lot even during the Soul Society arc as being this unstoppable monster. He battles and loses to a Shikai Ichigo that was buffed by Zangetsu using his Quincy powers. And later on, this same buffed Ichigo was able to clash with Byakuya for a short time. It's worth noting that this Ichigo was also pretty weakened and was still recovering from his battle with Kenpachi. Yoruichi says half of Ichigo's organs were crushed in his battle against Kenpachi, and just him moving in bed opened up his stitches and made him bleed. Yet despite this, he still goes on to fight and keep up with Byakuya, who is one of the stronger captains at this time. This Ichigo just arriving on the bridge actually shocked someone like Ukitake, who thought this half-dead Ichigo's spiritual pressure was comparable to a captain. This is also an Ichigo before his Bankai training, by the way. This is important because Kenpachi, after his fight with this Ichigo, arguably scales to him. This is where Kenpachi's scaling gets a little confusing, especially when not knowing about his mental nerfs in the 1000 Year Blood War manga. But he goes from losing to a buff Shikai Ichigo to fighting two powerful captains, Tosen and Kamomura, at the same time. Not only was Kenpachi messing around in this fight and had his eye patch on the entire time, but he also was still injured from his fight with Ichigo. But this buff he received allowed him to toss around two captains without being serious. This is impressive, and it's clear that after losing his battle with Ichigo, he unlocked one of his mental nerfs and received a massive buff, possibly around the level of the Ichigo that fought Byakuya on the bridge. We know Kenpachi adjusts himself according to his opponent's power level, and I don't think it's too far-fetched to say that even though he lost to that Ichigo, he adjusted himself to that same power level, which allowed him to do things most captains in this series wouldn't be able to do. By the time we get to the Urankar arc, Kenpachi does get a ton stronger alongside most characters in the series. The scaling shifts and we are introduced to Urankars and espadas that can rival the abilities of captains of the Gote 13, and we also get to see more of Kenpachi's mental nerfs lifted. In his battle against the 5th Espada Noritora, they both have an extremely close match to the point where Kenpachi actually thought he would die. Kenpachi's response to this is to use Kendo, and what's funny about this is that Kenpachi says, "Fine, I guess I'll use it. It's been a while since I used Kendo," alluding that he was holding back the entire time and needs to get more serious so that he doesn't die. He knows and understands that fighting and swinging with both hands is much more lethal in battle, but still chooses throughout the entirety of the series to hold back and fight with one hand, something even Unohana scolds him over later on during their fight. His potential in Kendo and his fighting abilities are so high that Central 46 urged Yamamoto to stop teaching Kenpachi Kendo after one day, for fear of Kenpachi growing too powerful. And by the time we get to the war arc, Shunsui's first task as head captain was to teach Kenpachi the way of the sword, knowing how valuable of an asset he is to the Soul Society. Central 46 of course tries to go against this, and Shunsui's like, "Hey, do you guys want to protect yourselves or not?" What Shunsui did, I think, not only speaks of his own intelligence of course, but also kind of proves that after Yamamoto's death, the only other major fighting force the Soul Society could count on was Kenpachi. So I kind of want to get into Yami scaling and some of the other espadas as well, because it's pretty important to Kenpachi's scaling. I will also be mentioning some Spirits Are Forever With You novel statements and scaling, since the novels have a lot to do with Kenpachi himself. Now, I'm not going to go over a long explanation on whether or not the novels are canon. This still shouldn't be a debate, to be honest, especially since Kubo has stated and proved their legitimacy numerous times. Few examples being Club Outside questions and data books on the novels, which are both answered and directly written by him. When he hasn't worked on something or thinks something isn't legit, he's had no problem in the past straight up saying so. The events of the Bleach Hell movie is a great example. Kubo has talked about and treats the novels as direct extensions of his own work, and there are tons of examples proving he considers the novels as part of Bleach's story. I could make an entire video on this topic proving Kubo considers the novels legit, but I do think most people do know that they are in fact canon to the main story of Bleach. But anyway, moving along. So Yami has numerous statements about him being the strongest of the Espada, and even though most of the community thinks it was poorly done, the foreshadowing of him being the strongest is actually shown a couple of times or hinted at. Back when Ukiura and Yami made their invasion to the world of the living, Yami gets beat up pretty bad by Yoruichi, and Ukiura says that Yami is dumb for not realizing that he can't beat Yoruichi or Kisuke at his current power level, hinting at Yami's power of being able to store up energy and spiritual pressure by eating a ton and sleeping. We actually see his size difference from when we first meet him in the world of the living to when he fights Chad, Rukia, and the others. Chad's even like, "Yo, this guy must be juicing or something because he got so huge in such a short amount of time." Even before his second transformation, Yami managed to tank a Getsuga from Ichigo to the neck with it only nicking him. This is a lot more impressive than people realize, especially because it's from that Ichigo. Not only did Ichigo receive a massive Zenkai-like boost after his fight with Ukiura, but his mask was different and hinted at being not only heavier, but stronger. Aizen also straight up says that Ichigo reached new heights after his battle with Ukiura. Granted, Ichigo wasn't completely healed since his Shuhakusho was about half gone, but this is still very impressive for Yami from a defensive standpoint, considering the massive boost in power that Ichigo received after fighting Ukiura. Kenpachi does say the battle with Yami was boring, but it's kind of just Kenpachi being cocky because both him and Byakuya are not only pretty beat up, but the 4th Division members who are literally doctors and masters of anatomy say that Kenpachi and Byakuya are acting tough but are pretty wounded from their fight with Yami. Unohana in the data books also adds on to this saying the same thing, that they were in pretty bad shape. So I think both things are true, that Kenpachi and Byakuya found the fight to be boring and only wanted to fight each other, but that obviously changed when Yami went into his second release form. Aside from statements, which Yami has plenty of, proof of his power can be seen on his effect on the environment. The sky above them was breaking because of their battle, and we know that Espadas 4 and up can't release in Fake Wake Mundo, but Yami did and even went into a much stronger form. Something I find quite funny is that despite how much people despise Yami and his reveal of being the secret strongest Espada, he has the most strongest statements alongside Aizen in the series. From the manga, data books to the novels, Yami is spoken about many times, and it's said that he was well worthy of his rank and title as Espada number 0. Spiritual pressure is quite a big thing among the Shinigamis and Arrancars, and it's talked about quite a bit. From the beginning, we're told that when two people are clashing, the one with the most spiritual energy wins. We've seen the perfect example of this back in the Soul Society arc when Ichigo is facing off against Kenpachi. Ichigo actually receives the damage that was meant for Kenpachi because of their difference in Ryatsu was so vast. Aizen also talks about how if you have more spiritual pressure, then you are stronger and can negate abilities. While he is somewhat right, his statement gets blown way out of proportion in the Bleach community. We quite literally don't see this happening often, and people think if someone has more spiritual pressure, they can bypass any ability, but this simply isn't true, and it's pretty disingenuous to constantly use in a debate. We see plenty of examples of this not happening, like Yoruichi, who was a noble, not being able to negate Soifon Shikai ability Suzemebachi, and the nobles are known to have high spiritual energy much higher than normal Shinigami. Byakuya, another noble, couldn't negate Zamari's Amor ability despite being in a class of his own when compared to Zamari. It's shown that to negate abilities like Aizen mentioned, the difference in Ryatsu would need to be vast. Not only does Aizen already have twice his spiritual energy as a captain, but the Soifon that he negged was already exhausted from her battle with Baragon. She fired her Bankai twice in one day, going beyond her limits, and had also lost an arm, something that we know makes a difference in both Shinigami and Arrancars. But aside from Aizen's statement that the community exaggerates, we do see a few examples of having higher spiritual pressure does at least make a difference in the battle. I mentioned the Kenpachi versus Ichigo example, and another pretty good example is Ukiura versus Grimjaw. Grimjaw's arm was badly burned after he clashed Seros with Ukiura, and they were just a 2-rank difference. Ukiura later on shows a cool spiritual pressure feat against Hollow Mask Ichigo. Ichigo uses Getsuga and Ukiura just stands there, and his spiritual pressure just tanks it. It doesn't even get past Ukiura's spiritual pressure, which is insane. This feat is so underrated, and we don't see things like this happening often in the series. Kenpachi in the Spirits Are Forever With You novels really embodies Aizen's statement about negating abilities if you have higher spiritual pressure. He does insane things that I don't think we've seen replicated from another Shinigami. So Sion Grants, who is a very important character in the novels, battles it out with Kenpachi Zuragi, and he uses the miniature doll ability on Kenpachi that he used on Renji and Uryu. Sion couldn't even crush the miniature doll of Kenpachi's organs in his hands because Kenpachi's spiritual energy was so high, saying that they were as hard as steel. Though it does say that Sion could have crushed it if he used his sword instead, and it also says that he couldn't collect enough spiritual matter in the area to create perfect clones and organs. Sion also goes on to say that if Kenpachi back during the Arrancar arc had fought Stark and Baragon, he would have destroyed Stark's swords and swatted away Baragon's Respira, which is insanely impressive. This Sion that Kenpachi fought for over an hour was stated by Mayuri to have spiritual pressure exceeding Yami at only 30% of his power, meaning at 100% of his full power, he has the spiritual energy of 3 Yamis, which is insane to think about. Uryu also straight up says that the Ryatsu coming from both Kenpachi and Sion is on the same level of full Hollow Ichigo. Cien is pretty insane and pretty much a War Arc level character, which isn't surprising since this same Kenpachi who he is equals with was one-shotting Stern Raiders like it was nothing. Now, Azashiro is pretty interesting and surprisingly underrated due to the fact that people think he lost to Kenpachi at full power. While he did lose to that Kenpachi, I don't think people understand exactly why. But Kenpachi doesn't get massively stronger after fighting Azashiro, or at least he doesn't scale to or adjust himself to a 100% Azashiro. We all know how Kenpachi's power works by adjusting himself to match his opponent so that he can have a close fight. So it also doesn't mean he will always get stronger depending on his opponent. We literally see this when he went from being stronger than Unohana as a child to being weaker than a buff Soul Society Ichigo. Azashiro also says that Kenpachi couldn't adjust his powers in enough time to match Ichigo's sudden increase in power. So it's crazy to think that Ichigo could have still lost if Kenpachi had succeeded. But anyway, Azashiro straight up says that if he had gotten serious from the beginning and used Taro 96, he could have killed Kenpachi, but he wanted to kill Kenpachi with as little power as necessary. Not only this, Azashiro was already weakened before fighting Kenpachi because the child Arrancar's Picaro had used an ability to steal Reishi. Azashiro is weak to absorbing types of attacks and suffers from this so badly that he actually passes out for a few minutes. Azashiro also at one point had given up on his life and wanting to fight because he thought the Soul King was angry with him. The entire time fighting Kenpachi, he was weakened physically and did not want to fight anymore, but he still did. A 100% Azashiro still scales to Kuryushiki, who has crazy lore which I'll get into soon. So I will still say that the Kenpachi during the first invasion that we see is about or slightly above the one that fought Cien and Azashiro. Azashiro does straight up say that Kenpachi doesn't really train and didn't train from the moment he lost to Ichigo up until he fought the Espada. So why is all of this important? Everything that I've talked about from the Espadas to how important spiritual pressure is for Shinigamis and Hollows and so on, is to show you the massive difference in power in Kenpachi and also Unohana, who scales massively even above the Kenpachi that I've talked about so far. And I don't mean by a little bit, I mean to the point where she was killing Kenpachi so fast over and over again that he thought he was just losing consciousness and didn't realize she was killing and then healing him. I don't think people realize just how skilled Unohana is and her reputation throughout the story. She learned 8,000 different types of Zanjutsu styles and gave herself the name Yachiru as a reward. Even after her death, she's known as the Death Sword, and alongside Ukitake in Yamamoto, had enough spiritual energy to break the lid covering hell after Aizen's banishment to Mugen and Yuha's death. Unohana thought the only suitable place to train Kenpachi was in the Mugen, a near-infinite place where the worst of criminals are kept, implying that their battle would be on such a level that a near-infinite place was needed to swing their blades. She is clearly someone who, with all of her titles and statements, is narratively in the same ballpark as Yamamoto and Shinigami Aizen, which I will touch on more in a bit. Shunsui, who is able to pressure elite guard level fighters, somewhat admits inferiority to Unohana and Kenpachi, calling Unohana's generation the strongest, with her being the strongest Shinigami as the standing Kenpachi. He also says that the Soul Society would be doomed if they don't train Kenpachi in the way of the sword, straight up telling Central 46 like, hey, if we don't train this guy, the Soul Society is gone, and Unohana is the only one who can do that. Shinji, a very old and wise captain, thought every Shinigami who was able should aid and protect Kenpachi after his fight with Grimmy, not wanting the Quincy's to jump him because the tide of the war would shift to the Stern Ritter side. Two of the wisest captains thinking that they would lose the war against the Quincy's if they lost Kenpachi or didn't train him says a lot about him being their strongest fighter. Something people kinda miss is that in the 1000 Year Blood War anime, when Unohana is speaking to herself about Kenpachi and his limitations, she straight up says that Kenpachi should have never lost to someone like Royd, which is pretty interesting. The Stern Ritter Y, they're yourself, who had the power to copy someone's memories, appearance, and powers. We learned in a Club Outside question that Royd can copy the power of someone around 70 to 80%. But what's impressive is that Unohana still thinks that Kenpachi, if he had been at his full strength with no limits, would have beaten Royd with no issues, even though Royd was 80% of Yuha's power. It adds on with the consistency of Kenpachi being Yamamoto's quote-unquote replacement as the Soul Society's main fighting power. Kenpachi and Yamamoto are both somewhat narratively compared to being the two strongest of the Soul Society and having tons of statements of being the strongest and being the Soul Society's main force of power. So I've always hated the idea and argument that Unohana is weak because she lost to base Kenpachi, but I don't think people really realize that their battle was never one-sided. Kenpachi literally talks about how he felt fear for the first time battling Unohana. She talks about how it was the first time someone rivaled Kenpachi's power and he was excited and also terrified of Unohana. You even see them tagging each other, and Unohana blocks an attack from Kenpachi and kicks him back before he even starts to lower his battle power to hers. Unohana does admit that Kenpachi could have killed her but decided not to and lowered his battle power to hers because of his love for fighting and how he probably would never fight someone as strong as her again. But they were clearly pretty close in power even without Unohana having apparent access to her Bankai and Kaido, which we don't see in the manga or the anime. It's implied she learned Kaido after her battle with Kenpachi, and we know for sure that Kenpachi's first time suppressing his power was during his battle with Unohana. I would argue Unohana got even stronger after learning Kaido, and it's totally plausible that she was also somewhat holding back when fighting Kenpachi since we don't see her using her Bankai, and for her love of battle like Kenpachi. But of course that's all speculation on my part and maybe would even contradict a few things, but I thought it was interesting to mention. It's also arguable that she was caught off guard by Kenpachi because of her saying that she never thought she would find such excitement crossing swords with a child. She did manage to win even though he lowered his battle power to hers, but I really think this speaks on her Zanjutsu skills and her battle IQ. Even while she's in Bankai during their battle to break down Kenpachi's mental barriers, she is seen overwhelming Kenpachi and still being able to keep up and block attacks from him once he is fully awakened. We know she isn't fighting this battle to win, but to help free Kenpachi from his own mental state, which is the whole theme of their battle. Now, her Bankai has always been a topic of discussion on what it actually does and how strong it is. It's mostly thought within the community that the red blood from her Bankai is acidic, which honestly would make a lot of sense because of how her Shikai works Minazuki, using its stomach acid to heal people. Unfortunately, even with the anime, it's still not confirmed and we don't see it hurting Unohana or Kenpachi. The Bankai does have an amazing healing ability though, almost similar to the Arrancar's high-speed regeneration, but we don't know if it also works on other people. The Bankai being able to change the entire environment around Unohana is interesting and kind of gives her an edge in whatever battle she's in. We see her slapping around awakened Kenpachi multiple times with these blood whip-like blades and is so skilled at swinging her sword that she can even create a force field of blood slashes around her. The range of this Bankai is actually pretty impressive and it's a really good offensive and defensive type of Bankai, which is probably thanks to her sword skills. If you guys are Soulsborne fans and have played either Elden Ring or Bloodborne, you probably know of the two famous blood katanas, the Chikage and the Rivers of Blood. Her Bankai kinda reminds me of them, but hers is obviously to a much larger degree. She acknowledges that no one but Kenpachi's power exceeds her own, but how true was this statement? At least when compared to the other Shinigami like Aizen, Yamamoto, and even Kuryoshiki. Kuryoshiki's lore is pretty interesting, and he's one of the few Shinigami that is hyped up to being one of the strongest. Kuryoshiki actually received an invitation from the Zero Division to become one of the 5 captains that protect the Soul King. Now this is a lot more impressive than people realize because you're supposed to have created something of value in the Soul Society to become a member. But Kuryoshiki, despite not creating anything, was wanted by Ichibei. It's clear that it was due to his power and probably his leadership skills, which even Shunsui hints at when talking to him, saying that Kuryoshiki was invited to the royal palace because of his strength and that they probably needed someone powerful to lead the guards. The 13 Blades data book supports this by saying Kuryoshiki has power that rivals the Zero Division. Now, whether or not that means he rivals the Zero Division as a whole or their sealed forms is questionable, but I don't think Ichibei would personally invite Kuryoshiki if he wasn't overwhelmingly powerful. He does die to Azashiro, but I think it's just been consistent that the Kenpachis are the strongest Shinigami, possibly aside from anomalies like Aizen and Yamamoto, which I will get into shortly, but also even above the Zero Division members. All of these Kenpachis either having statements or feats to prove so. But despite Kuryoshiki being someone that rivals the Zero Division members, Unohana still thinks her and Kenpachi are in a class of their own. Yamamoto has really good lore and has always been seen as this unstoppable and unbeatable force of nature. He is known as the Demon of the Sword and is both feared and respected by Yuha and Aizen, to the point that they would rather cheat than face him in a straight up battle. Tokunada Tsuneyashiro, one of the head nobles from the Can't Fear Your Own World novels, and probably the most observant person in this series, believed that no one could have beaten Yamamoto. He is someone that even in Shikai is hinted at having some type of transcendent level of power, and in Bankai is capable of destroying the Soul Society just by existing. Yamamoto believes that no Shinigami born in the past 1000 years has surpassed him when talking to Aizen, which has always been hinted at Kenpachi being the one born to eventually surpass him. But what's interesting that people forget is that Yamamoto had made up his mind to sacrifice himself just so he could kill Aizen, without even knowing about his fusion with the Hogyoku. I think it speaks volumes of how powerful Shinigami Aizen is, but I think it can be argued that Yamamoto decided that because he didn't think he can beat Aizen without his Bankai, which I think it's implied he couldn't use it because he would destroy Karakura Town. He even had to stop the flames from his Shikai from being released inside of Wonderwise because it would have destroyed the town, something Aizen also confirms. Aizen does admit to Yamamoto that yeah, you probably would win, but I really don't want to risk whether or not that's true. Something people like to bring up a lot is that Aizen was never scared of Unohana, but I kind of have a few pushbacks on why that statement isn't necessarily true. I think there is a very simple answer as to why Aizen and even Yuha were not very concerned with Unohana. It's really because Unohana became the Gotei's healer and faithfully stood in that role no matter what was happening. We see this twice during the Arrancar arc and then the Quincy War and Thousand Year Blood War. Unohana felt her role was to not fight and only heal, even if that meant everyone dying. Yamamoto in Thousand Year Blood War before the first invasion literally orders her and Squad 4 to not leave their barracks no matter what happens. Unohana follows this order, and even Isane was crying because she felt like they could have saved more people if they left anyway. Even when the captains were getting cut down one by Aizen, and when Yamamoto fell, Unohana never stepped in. Even Tenjiro in Thousand Year Blood War after the first invasion was like, hey, you need to be fighting right now on the front lines and not healing. And this is right after he called the rest of the Gotei weak and pathetic for not being able to protect the Soul Society, implying that after Yamamoto's death, Unohana is the only worthy warrior among them. We also know that Yuha removes and changes the special war power ranking as they get more information. We see this when Ichigo during the second invasion takes Kenpachi's spot as the #1 most dangerous special war power. So I say that to say that there probably was a reason why both Yuha and Aizen never worried about Unohana, because they understood her role in the story. It wouldn't make sense for them not to be fearful or at least weary of the woman who can match the same guy in power that both Yuha and Aizen were so worried about. Plus her being the only surviving member aside from Yamamoto of the original Gotei 13, I'm sure Yuha had his concerns but knew how serious Unohana took her role as the Soul Society's healer. So I would say Aizen and Yuha were in fact probably concerned about her. Aizen literally was afraid to fight Kenpachi without the help of the Hogyoku, with his only knowledge of Kenpachi being his fight with Unohana in the past when he was a kid. I think aside from Unohana's statement and implications of being the strongest Shinigami, Aizen's statement about needing the Hogyoku to fight Kenpachi is what gets her up there in the same tier as Aizen and Yamamoto. This statement is a lot more important than people realize, and it's kind of the second time Aizen admitted that he can't or probably can't beat either Yamamoto or Kenpachi head on without taking away their Zanpakuto or needing the Hogyoku. I think you can totally use Aizen's statement about Kenpachi and say that because he felt like he needed the Hogyoku, Kenpachi and by extension Unohana would have to at least be somewhat relative to Aizen's first Hogyoku transformation. I do think Unohana versus Aizen is pretty close, and even though Aizen admits he needs the Hogyoku to fight Kenpachi, Unohana kinda also admits when talking to Ichigo that Aizen is a problem because of his Kyoka Sugetsu. Kinda saying that yeah, Aizen is strong but he has one up on me because of Kyoka Sugetsu. It's funny because all three of these guys, Yamamoto, Shinigami Aizen, and Unohana, are shown to be extremely close in power with statements and feats and would have to fight to the death to beat one another. Tokunada is stated to be inferior to Aizen because of their massive difference in Ryatsu, saying Aizen and Yamamoto reached a level beyond common sense when compared to Tokunada, someone who Shunsui thought he couldn't let his guard down around. It's apparent that the noble tier of fighters like Byakuya, Yoruichi, and Shunsui still haven't reached that Aizen and Yamamoto tier of power, even though they are so powerful, something Kenpachi and Unohana have clearly already done. All in all, I think Unohana is a great character with very complex scaling that has been heavily downplayed within the community. I really hate that she had to die so early in Thousand Year Blood War and would have loved to have seen her fight one of the elites like Gerard. She clearly would have done a lot better than someone like Byakuya, who was barely barely there for support. I hope this video has cleared up any misconceptions or questions about her scaling, and if I changed at least one person's mind today about her, then I'll be quite satisfied. If not, how powerful do you think she is? Subscribing and sharing this video would be very much appreciated. I have more videos like this in the works that I think you guys will enjoy. Join our Discord, and till next time.